October 1962. The world held its breath as Soviet ships approached Cuba, carrying nuclear missiles aimed at American cities. President Kennedy stared down Premier Khrushchev in what historians would call the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity ever came to nuclear annihilation. Khrushchev backed down because Moscow knew it couldn't win a nuclear exchange against America's overwhelming arsenal. What if he hadn't calculated that risk? What if October 1962 ended not with Soviet ships turning around, but with the first mushroom clouds rising over Florida? In 1962, the bipolar world order had crystallized into two armed camps, each convinced the other represented existential evil. On one side, the United States commanded approximately 26,000 nuclear warheads, thousands ready for immediate launch. America had strategic bombers circling constantly, Minuteman ICBMs in hardened silos across the Great Plains, Polaris submarines lurking beneath the Atlantic, and Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, pointed directly at Soviet cities. NATO forces stretched from Norway to Turkey, a defensive line backed by tactical nuclear weapons scattered across West Germany like deadly confetti. On the other side, the Soviet Union possessed roughly 3,000 nuclear warheads, but here's where the asymmetry becomes terrifying. Moscow had perhaps a few dozen ICBMs capable of reaching American soil, and only about 150 long-range bombers. The Soviets couldn't match America's strategic nuclear arsenal, which meant they were perpetually tempted by the logic of use it or lose it. But what they lacked in intercontinental reach, they compensated for with overwhelming conventional superiority in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Warsaw Pact troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, stretched from East Germany to the Ural Mountains, ready to sweep across the North German plain toward the English Channel. The Soviets also possessed thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, smaller bombs designed for battlefield use, creating a terrifying possibility, a conventional war in Europe that goes nuclear within hours.
China, meanwhile, sat isolated and nursing grievances against both superpowers. The Sino-Soviet split was fracturing communist solidarity, and China wouldn't detonate its first atomic bomb until 1964. In 1962, China was still reeling from the Great Leap Forward famine, its economy shattered, its military massive but technologically primitive. The non-aligned movement led by India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt represented the newly decolonized world trying to chart a third path, but they were spectators with front-row seats to potential annihilation. Now here's the critical detail that makes 1962 uniquely catastrophic. The technology was crude. The doctrine was apocalyptic, and the warning systems were primitive. America's single integrated operational plan, PSYOP for short, wasn't designed for limited nuclear war. It was an all-you-can-destroy buffet. If you launched everything, hitting Soviet command centers, air bases, missile silos, industrial cities, and population centers in one massive coordinated strike. There was no dial-it-back option, no surgical strikes, no proportional response. It was binary. Peace or Armageddon. So let's say it happens. Let's say an American U-2 gets shot down over Cuba and Kennedy authorizes airstrikes. Soviet forces in Cuba, operating under standing orders and cut off from Moscow by communication delays, fire a tactical nuclear weapon at the invading American fleet. Washington interprets this as a strategic first strike. Within 90 minutes, PSYOP is activated. B-52 bombers already airborne receive their go codes and turn towards Soviet targets. Minutemen missiles ignite in their silos across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, arcing over the North Pole toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Sverdlovsk. Polaris submarines off the Norwegian coast launch their missiles at Soviet naval bases and command bunkers. Jupiter missiles in Turkey fire their 1.4 megaton warheads toward targets in Ukraine and southern Russia. The first warheads begin detonating over the Soviet Union within 30 minutes.
Moscow's response is immediate, but more limited. Soviet ICBMs, numbering only in the dozens, launched toward American cities. New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle. Soviet bombers that manage to get airborne face American air defenses, but some break through. Submarines closer to the American coast fire what few missiles they carry. Within 2 hours, approximately 300 nuclear weapons detonate on American soil. It's devastating, but it's a fraction of what hits the Soviet Union, which absorbs nearly 3,000 warheads. But here's where the geopolitical logic becomes a nightmare. Europe isn't a theater of war. Europe is the sacrifice zone. Soviet commanders, watching their homeland burn, order Warsaw Pact forces to surge westward across the inner German border. Tactical nuclear weapons are employed immediately to break NATO defensive lines. NATO responds with its own tactical nuclear arsenal. Within 48 hours, cities like Hamburg, Frankfurt, Warsaw, Prague, and East Berlin cease to exist as functioning entities. London, Paris, Rome, and Brussels are hit by Soviet medium-range missiles. The Ruhr Valley, Europe's industrial heartland, becomes a radiological dead zone. The death toll in the first week approaches 200 million, but the killing has just started. Firestorms consume the remains of cities, injecting vast quantities of soot into the upper atmosphere. Global temperatures begin dropping within weeks as sunlight is blocked, a phenomenon that wouldn't be termed nuclear winter until decades later in our timeline, but which would manifest with brutal efficiency in this one. Agriculture collapses across the northern hemisphere. Radioactive fallout blankets thousands of square miles, making them uninhabitable for decades. Now let's talk about who survives and what that means. Neither superpower is destroyed entirely. The United States government, evacuated to hardened bunkers, survives. So does the Soviet leadership scattered across the Urals. But neither has a functioning economy. Neither has a legitimate claim to global leadership, and neither has the capacity to project power beyond their own devastated territories. America's GDP collapses by 70% within a year. The Soviet Union, already economically fragile, fragments as regional military commanders assert autonomy, unable to receive coherent orders from Moscow. Western Europe, the economic engine that would have created the European Union, is reduced to scattered survival zones separated by radiation belts and collapsed infrastructure. There will be no Brussels, no euro, no single market. The concept of Europe as a unified geopolitical entity dies in the firestorms of 1962. China survives relatively intact, geographically distant from the main exchange. But survival isn't the same as thriving. Global trade collapses, and China, still agrarian and technologically backward, finds itself isolated in a world where the old order has vanished, but no new one can form. Without access to foreign technology, capital, or markets, China's rise is delayed by decades, if it happens at all. India, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, these nations become the unexpected inheritors of a shattered world, but they lack the infrastructure, the capital, and the technological base to fill the void. The world doesn't become multipolar, it becomes fragmented, a patchwork of regional zones struggling to maintain industrial civilization. Here's the dark irony. The Cold War was fundamentally an ideological contest. Democracy versus communism, capitalism versus central planning, freedom versus the dictatorship of the proletariat. Both sides claim to represent humanity's future. But when the missiles fly and the cities burn, both narratives are incinerated. The survivors don't ask which system was better. They ask why anyone trusted either side with the power to end the world. The concept of superpower legitimacy dies with the mushroom clouds. National sovereignty becomes a quaint relic when borders are defined by radiation levels and humanitarian corridors. What emerges in the decades after is a world no science fiction writer predicted. Not a triumphant global government, not a clean slate for utopia, but a grinding, fragmented struggle where the primary political question isn't left versus right, but survival versus collapse. Warlords control resource-rich regions. Technocratic enclaves hoard pre-war knowledge. Vast populations migrate toward the southern hemisphere, overwhelming nations that had been peripheral in the old order. The nuclear taboo isn't strengthened, it's shattered. Every regional power that can cobble together a weapons program does so, because the lesson of 1962 isn't that nuclear weapons are too dangerous to use. It's that not having them means you're a victim.